Dobrý den, dnes máme v Echu speciálního hosta, jím dobře známý americký profesor ekonomie Jeffreym Sachs z Univerzity Columbie v New Yorku. Jeffreym Sachs má jednu českou spojku, jeho manželka je totiž z Prahy a je to člověk, který na začátku 90. let, řekl bych, doprovázel proces transformace v různých zemích bývalého sovětského bloku, jak například v Polsku, tak třeba právě i v Rusku. A v posledních letech nebo v posledních měsících velmi výrazně zasahuje do západní debaty o válce na Ukrajině speciálně a vůbec o americké zahraniční politice v posledních letech. Jeffreym Sachs je kritikem této politiky a já si od našeho rozhovoru slibuju, že to bude kontroverzní počin, který doufám, že bude mít hodně diváků a že jich hodně zvedne ze židle. Tak a přicházím do angličtiny a ptám se pana Sachse první otázku. Mr. Sachs, I would like to start by one very profound question. Do you think is the situation now regarding Russia-Ukraine war that serious? That we are on the brink of the World War III, or at least of a big confrontation?
We are definitely on a continued path of escalation. The war is devastating for Ukraine, and the war is escalating. The United States doesn't want to lose. Russia will not lose. And so each side keeps putting in more armaments, more advanced weapons, more attacks that pass the so-called red lines that each other has set. And the war spreads because the United States brings in its allies, even from Asia, into the war in providing materials, munitions, and so on. Russia does the same. And so this is an escalating battle of the two world's largest nuclear superpowers. It's completely reckless and out of control, extraordinarily dangerous in my view.
What were the recent developments that scared you most? Could you name like 2 or 3 moments?
One was a couple of weeks ago when Ukraine, it seems, attacked 2 times radar systems that are part of Russia's early warning nuclear attack systems, or nuclear warning systems, I should say. In other words, they are radars that give Russia the information of whether there is an incoming nuclear attack. 2 of these radar systems were hit by Ukrainian drones. When that happened, one of America's leading nuclear war experts immediately contacted me, an academic. He said that he did not believe that people in the White House or the State Department understood how reckless and dangerous that action was. And he asked me to forward materials to the White House and to the State Department and to others, which I promptly did. I think that this illustrates how the Ukrainian side is desperate. It will do anything, even drag the world into nuclear war, because it's a very desperate regime. So this is what's worrisome. I also have very serious doubts about the U.S. leadership at this time. The President of the United States is very old. He's infirm, and I don't believe that we have necessarily a steady hand in the leadership. So all of this concerns me enormously.
When you pass such materials on to the White House, do you get any response, or is it just like black hole?
The emails don't bounce, that I can tell you, but otherwise I don't get any response. I know these people. I sent the message, and that's all that I expected.
You know them personally, people like Jake Sullivan?
Sure.
And would you say, in general, are they receptive?
Not very receptive, no. I think that we have a foreign policy team that has been with a project in Ukraine for more than a decade, that has wanted NATO expansion as a core part of American foreign policy, that has taken what we call the neoconservative view, and I don't think that they're receptive to my views, but I'm not very happy with their views.
People here who are basically in favor of helping Ukraine would say in this situation or in a situation like this, either that Putin is bluffing, so we actually do not have that much to fear from him, or that we, like Central Europe or West in general, have no other choice than oppose Russia and stop Russia as soon as possible. I would like to ask you regarding the first point, which is whether Putin is bluffing. And these people would argue that the Russian president already made various threats during the last 2 years, that he draw more red lines, and then every time we crossed, like we the West crossed the red lines, nothing happened basically. So like we did send, or the Americans and Germans and British sent tanks to Ukraine, nothing happened. The Americans provided Ukrainians with a HIMARS system, nothing happened. So what is different now? So why should the last red line, Putin's, or the red lines he is drawing now, why should we take them more seriously than the previous ones?
What's happened in the last 2 years is that 500,000 Ukrainians have died, and the battlefield has raged, and much of Ukraine in the east is being destroyed by war. And people who say, don't worry about nuclear war, make me shudder. Of course we should worry. How can people say, well, it's likely the world won't be destroyed, or don't worry, we haven't crossed Putin's red lines. These people apparently know nothing of history or are willing to gamble the lives of my children and grandchildren because they think that there's nothing to worry about. They don't know. What they fail to understand is the reality of this situation, that we have a major war, that it is escalating, that each side of this war has 6,000 nuclear warheads, that we've come close to the brink of nuclear war on several occasions in history, sometimes by accident, sometimes by a hot-headed leader, sometimes by a mistake on the radar screen. We need absolutely to be a little bit smarter than saying, oh, don't worry about it.
Maybe just the people think that that they do not want to look like cowards who gave up to Putin's threats.
But the problem is that people don't understand what this is all about. They don't understand the origins of this crisis. They don't understand how this has evolved. They don't understand the role of the United States in this. Of course, the people of the Czech Republic may love the United States because, well, we know the history of the Cold War and so forth, but they don't really understand the United States, and they don't understand what this crisis is, and they don't understand what Russia's concerns are also. Of course, again, after domination by the Soviet Union for so many decades and such a terrible period in Czech history, people don't want to think about it other than good and evil, but they need to understand, because we need to avoid nuclear war and we need to avoid the destruction of Ukraine. And people who think that they are Ukraine's friends right now are doing Ukraine not purposely, but inadvertently, a huge disservice. Ukraine is being destroyed right now because of this ongoing war, and we are not seeing in Europe any attempt to end the war. And people in Europe don't understand, it seems to me, the roots of this war. And so that is really my main problem. I don't want to gamble the future of the world because somebody has a hunch of what Russia may or may not do. That's not the way to behave as responsible people in this world. And I want people to think clearly about where this conflict arose, because it's not as we tell ourselves in fairy tales. It's a bit more complicated. And I want people to think about how the war can actually be ended. Because when people say, as they do, oh, we must defeat Russia, I don't think people are thinking very clearly about what it means to defeat a country with 6,000 nuclear warheads. Well, they say, oh, don't worry about it. But that is an excuse for thinking. That's not real thinking.
You'll come to this immediately. I just wanted to ask one specific question. You mentioned Ukraine's losses, and you used the figure 500,000 dead people. How do you know? So Ukrainian estimates, the official estimates are, of course, very low, and no one basically trusts them. But yours are, on the other side, very high.
I listen to every side. I listen to Ukrainian channels. I listen to Russian channels. I listen to American channels. I listen to British channels. I read every side of this issue. I watch the battlefield accounts. Nobody knows for sure. But the losses are enormously high. The graveyards across Ukraine are everywhere. I don't know if people are watching the videos. Maybe they're not shown in the Czech Republic or not, of young people being dragged off the streets in Ukraine to be sent to the front line. I know from direct reports. I know from people involved. I know from emails that I get that a whole generation of Ukrainians has been lost, dead and wounded, or escaped. This is a tragedy of massive proportions. I know that what Zelensky said about 31,000 dead is so sadly false that it's even a shame to propagandists. Propagandists should do and say things that at least have an air of plausibility, not absurdity. And unfortunately, Zelensky often speaks absurdity because he thinks that that's what the paymasters in the United States want to hear.
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, the 2 points people usually make here about Putin. So the first was Putin is bluffing, and the second is that we actually should take Russia deadly serious because Russia is inherently imperial power. And if we do not stop them in Ukraine, then they will go on and on to the West and be in the Czech Republic, in Germany, maybe in France, like in a couple of years. Do you think, so to me, this is probably the most profound question about this war. From the Russian point of view, do you think is this war an act of aggression, or do they think they are actually on defense, the Russians?
The Russians absolutely think that they are on the defensive side. And while that may seem extraordinary to people listening, it's really important to understand the history of this current conflict. It's also really important to avoid easy national stereotypes. Russia is not the Soviet Union, first of all. And also, what happened, however tragic in the past, doesn't have to repeat in the future. Do people in the Czech Republic say the same thing about Germany as they say about Russia? If ever there were a country that damaged the world, it was Germany in the 20th century twice. And yet I believe that Germany is now an ally of the Czech Republic. It's part of NATO. Do people in the Czech Republic say, well, Germany's likely to invade us? You see, they did in 1939. You see, they are Nazis. You see, Germany is always expansionist. This is their very nature. This is the kind of talk that is wrong and destructive and simplistic and dangerous. Yes, it's easy to have enemies. It's easy to make wars that are not needed because you create the inhuman enemy on the other side, and then you take actions to protect yourself against the inhuman enemy, and they interpret your actions as aggressive, and they take actions, and then you say, you see, that proves they are inhuman. The Russians are beasts. They're just imperialists. They're just expansionists. Well, okay, if you say so, what about Germany? Do you feel the same way? Yes, we can't trust Germany. They're Nazis. Well, I don't think we want to say that. I don't think that this is correct. A very wise president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, said something very smart 61 years ago when he spoke to the Parliament of Ireland. He said, across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme law of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this planet. This is very smart. Across the gulfs and barriers that now divide us, we must remember there are no permanent enemies. Hostility is a fact, but it is not the supreme law. Let us have some sense and understand history and understand how to resolve conflicts and stop talking about, oh, I don't think nuclear war is so likely, let's go ahead. As if this is a casual decision like rolling the dice or playing a board game. It is not. This is life and death, and we should be a lot more serious than we are in how our public discourse goes. We are not living in 1938. We are not living in 1968. We are living in 2024, and we had better take responsibility for 2024.
Coming back to the origins of this Russia-Ukraine war, how would the Russians come to believe that they were being cheated by the West?
Well, I know it because I have been involved in Russia and Ukraine and a little bit in the Czech Republic and Poland and all over the region.
In the early 90s.
For 35 years, even before the early 90s, starting in 1989. I have watched close up. I knew President Gorbachev. I knew President Yeltsin. I know President Kuchma. I know the leadership of the region. I watched this. The problem is the following. In 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War. He didn't want to be defeated by the United States. He wanted to end the Cold War. He disbanded the Warsaw Pact, and his Western counterparts at the highest levels promised NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward. By the way, all of that is very well documented, but probably your president would stand up and say, that's a lie, Mr. Sachs. But it's not a lie. It's all carefully documented. People can find it online if they care to look in a place called the National Security Archive, which is maintained by George Washington University. And they can look at a website that's called What Gorbachev Heard, and another website that's called What Yeltsin Heard. Because what they heard from the U.S. Secretary of State James Baker III, what they heard from the German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, was that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. Now, of course, this was a lie of the U.S. because the U.S. already starting in 1991-92 said, we've won the Cold War. Now we run the world. We are the unipolar power. We can do what we want. Our defense secretary in 1992 was Richard Cheney. If anyone thinks he's a nice man, you should read something to understand about Richard Cheney.
Back then?
He was defense secretary for George H.W. Bush Sr., and then he was the man who launched the Iraq War in 2003 on false premises. He believed in U.S. supremacy. He believed in U.S. hegemony. He believed in a U.S. unipolar world. He believed literally the United States is the policeman of the world. Constibulatory duties, he called it, he and his colleagues in the neoconservative movement. They had a grandiose and arrogant vision of the United States, and they believed that they had won the Cold War. Now the United States can do what it wants. So despite these promises, NATO began to move eastward, of course, to the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary first in 1999, in complete contradiction to the promises that were given to Yeltsin and to Putin. So that's the first reason for concern.
Can I interrupt you? There is one counter-argument to this. This famous sentence.
It wasn't a sentence, by the way. It was multiple meetings, multiple documents, multiple discussions. It wasn't a sentence.
I thought these specific words about not 1 inch eastwards
applied only to Germany.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, this is
the favorite argument.
This is U.S. propaganda. Please look at the National Security Archives of George Washington University, not the spin of the U.S. government.
So it's
period.
You think
this was clear. This was explicit. This was heatedly debated inside the U.S. government in the mid-1990s. Our defense secretary under William Clinton, whose name is William Perry, almost resigned under protest. He said, we are cheating. He said, this is so unwise. Our leading scholar statesman of the era, named George Kennan, the man who famously coined the idea of containment of the Soviet Union in 1946-47, said this is the worst decision the Americans have taken since the end of the Cold War. It will lead to a new crisis. So this was not a sentence. This was not a trick. This is not a matter of semantics. This was a matter of policy. And the United States cheated.
Yeah.
Then the United States continued its unilateralism. I know people in Prague won't want to hear this necessarily, or people in the Czech Republic, because America's the good side. And they say, yes, and it protects us. But please understand the view from the other side. In 1999, the United States bombed Belgrade for 78 straight days. This is the first war in Europe after 1945. I'm not talking about, of course, the occupation of of Czechoslovakia in 1968. I'm talking about the open war. And the U.S. bombed Belgrade for 78 days because they wanted to break Serbia in two. And they wanted to put a NATO base in Kosovo, which they have done. And it's the Eastern Command for the Balkans region in Bond Steel base in Kosovo. That was 1999, completely against international law.
They would argue they had to stop the ongoing genocide back then in Kosovo.
Yes, they would argue that, but almost anyone that actually knows the facts knows that the United States gave an ultimatum to Milosevic that was designed to be rejected because Madeleine Albright wanted to go to war against. I mentioned Madeleine Albright. I know she has a new street named after her, but I have to say she was a warmonger also. She wanted war against Milosevic. Period.
Yeah.
These are facts, and they are well known. And, you know, even afterwards, whatever the explanation one gives for 78 days of bombing Belgrade illegally, why a new country? Oh, because the United States wanted to break apart Serbia. Where is the sacred lines of nations? Well, only when the U.S. doesn't want the country to be divided. So the U.S. often divides other countries, like it did with Sudan and South Sudan, joining in that civil war, like it did in Serbia, dividing Kosovo. Then to understand the Russian point of view. In 2002, the U.S. unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was of grave concern to the Russians. It was a reckless move by one of our most reckless presidents, but certainly our most reckless vice president in history, Richard Cheney. It was part of the new order of American unipolarity. We don't need treaties anymore. We will do what we want. And the United States started putting in its Aegis missile systems in Poland and in Romania. And the Russians were absolutely aghast and furious. You have treaty commitments. The U.S. said, no, we don't. We don't have treaty commitments anymore. Then, just to move the chronology, NATO expanded to 7 more countries in 2004. And this included the 3 Baltic states, so very close to Russia. This included Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. So leave the anti-ballistic missile treaty, expand NATO to 7 more countries. And then in 2003, the United States went to war in Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein on totally false premises. They were obviously false. This isn't that we were surprised we got there and there weren't weapons of mass destruction. They went to war on false premises, claiming that they knew that there were weapons of mass destruction. Russia was watching once again because Saddam Hussein was an ally of Russia. Well, that war then went on for the next 20 years. The next one to come was in 2011. President Obama, very much liked, he gave a famous speech in Prague, of course, on peace. And in 2011, he tasked the CIA with overthrowing the Syrian government.
How do we know?
Well, how do we know? Oh, that's all very well documented, but not covered in public. It's called Operation Timber Sycamore. And the presidential findings in 2012 and 2013 are well known, but we know in 2011 that President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said explicitly that man must go. In other words, the President of the United States said that the President of Syria must go. They said that publicly. That wasn't hidden. They started massive arms shipments. They started a CIA operation. The exact timing of all of the findings is not known. But we do know, and you can look it up in the New York Times, they covered it one day because that's how the American propaganda works. They didn't tell the American people that the U.S. had gone to war with Syria. It was a CIA covert operation.
Basically helping Al-Qaeda in the end.
It was to fund jihadists like Al-Qaeda together with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to overthrow the Syrian government. This is what it was. But by the way, people don't necessarily know, but the United States government does this for a living. This isn't a rare occurrence. The United States has been engaged in around 90 regime change operations, mostly led by the CIA. This is why the U.S. is viewed as very dangerous by countries like Russia, because the U.S. has a covert army as well as an overt army, and the U.S. intention is not favorable to countries that the United States does not like. It's not trying to find stability, it's trying to overthrow them. Even in the case of Russia, it's well known that Cheney and Zbigniew Brzezinski both talked about dividing Russia, dismembering Russia, weakening Russia internally. Cheney said in 1992, well, now the Soviet Union's at an end, why not Russia as well? This is discussed in memoirs of people. This isn't public documents in this case. This is discussed in the memoirs of people like Robert Gates, former CIA director. But if you are a student of American politics as I am, these things are not a surprise or an aberration. They are how American politics works. The U.S. has overthrown or tried to overthrow dozens and dozens of governments around the world. Now, this brings us to 2014. The U.S. engaged in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in the Maidan in 2014. Of course, I think in the history that's told in the Czech Republic, people are said, well, that was the revolution of dignity.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
the Ukrainian people. I happened to see with my own eyes the U.S. funding the Maidan. Please don't be naive. I saw it for a very particular reason, which was after the Maidan had violently overthrown Yanukovych, violently, I was asked by the new post-coup government, please, Mr. Sachs, come and discuss our economic crisis. I didn't know better, so I flew to Kyiv, and then somebody showed me and explained to me how the U.S. had funded the Maidan. They laid it out. They actually walked me through the Maidan because there were still crowds there. They explained to me the U.S. funding. You know, it made me sick. But just to tell you, this is not innocent operation. This is not an overthrow. The United States recognized a government brought in by a violent coup within one day. Now, why did it do that? Why didn't it say that Viktor Yanukovych is the constitutional president and he should be allowed to serve out his term? And you probably know that 3 European foreign ministers had negotiated with Yanukovych a deal for early elections that were going to come later in 2014. And then the leaders of the coup said, no early elections, we take power. And the United States recognized the new government immediately. Do you think that this is an innocent coincidence? I do not. And if you have any doubt, please listen to Victoria Nuland on tape, intercepted by the Russians in late January 2014, speaking with the U.S. ambassador at the time, Jeffrey Piat. And it's on tape. You can listen to the BBC website.
I did.
Okay. And she talks about who the new government is, who it's going to be. It's not going to be Klitschko. It's going to be Yatsenuk. And you know what? It was Yats who called me to say, come meet with me afterwards. I didn't know, of course. But this is the clearest, direct U.S. meddling in the internal politics of Ukraine.
So Yats called you?
He didn't call me personally. He called me indirectly. But he asked me to come to Kiev, yes.
And he was already appointed the prime minister.
I'm sorry?
At this point, he was already appointed.
He was already prime minister, yes.
Okay. And as you said that you were shown or explained that the U.S. was funding the Maidan events.
How the funding went, and I don't want to talk about it more.
And did they fund it, the U.S. already before Maidan took place, or did they only start it?
No.
Afterwards,
the U.S. put in a huge amount of money, billions of dollars for years, on Ukrainian politics. Victoria Nuland explained that. She said, we've invested $5 billion in this project.
She said in creation of the civil society in
yes,
Ukraine.
Exactly. That's it. You know what that is. Okay, I know what that is. I think everybody knows what that is. People could say, oh, that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I say that it's U.S. meddling in the internal affairs of Ukraine, and that's why, because we're discussing why Russia is interested in this. Because Russia sees, my God, the United States is involved in a coup of a pro-Russian president next door to us. Okay, they're not shocked, by the way. They're not shocked by this. You know, this is one of the main points that I find interesting. President Putin came out of the KGB. He understands how the CIA works. He understands this is reality for him. This is not a game. This is reality. So this is why he has a very clear understanding of how the U.S. operates. And this is where the concerns come in.
Yeah.
By the way, in 2008, the U.S. ambassador to Russia was William Burns, who is now the CIA director. William Burns wrote a famous memo back to the U.S. Secretary of State from Moscow, explaining that the Russian opposition to NATO enlargement to Ukraine was not about Putin. It was across the entire political class. It was all Russians in the political class. They don't want NATO on their 2,100-kilometer border with Ukraine. They don't want NATO there. Now, just to bring it to the present, in 2014, after the coup, there were two breakaway regions of Ukraine, the Russian ethnic regions of Lugansk and Donetsk. They broke away. The parts of the military took equipment and declared that these were now new people's republics separate from Ukraine. Russia did not claim the Donbass. Russia did not say, well, now we rebuild the Russian Empire. Russia said, we need to have peace and negotiate a settlement. And that led to the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. And the Minsk II agreement in particular was endorsed by the UN Security Council, by the United States, by Germany, by France. It called for autonomy of the eastern regions of Ukraine. Autonomy. And I know what happened. I hope other people know what happened. The Ukrainians laughed at that. Oh, we're not going to give autonomy, even though they signed the treaty. And even though France and Germany were guarantors of the treaty called the Normandy process. And my Ukrainian counterparts at the time told me, we're never going to implement Minsk II. Don't even think about it. So this was another step in the collapse of any kind of trust whatsoever. That was 2015 to 2021. And Angela Merkel told Die Zeit a couple of years ago, oh, yes, we didn't really see this as more than giving time to Ukraine to build up its military strength. So this was another trick of the West. This was not an agreement, which Russia thought this is a diplomatic agreement. This was yet another trick. Then Biden came in, and the Russians sought reassurances that the United States would stop putting missile placements near Russia. This is a matter of supreme concern to the Russian leadership. Missiles that are a few minutes away from Moscow. And the United States, in fact, not only walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, but Trump walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty in 2019. So the whole edifice of nuclear control was collapsed. And the Russians were very worried. And they, in 2021, asked Biden, stop the NATO enlargement and stop the placement of missile systems near our border. It's deeply destabilizing and deeply threatening. Biden rejected both points of Russia, even though I believe that both points were completely right. And again, I hope I don't upset people that are listening, but Russia can also be right in what it's asking for diplomatically. It's not always wrong. And especially in this history of the U.S. walking away from nuclear agreements, overthrowing governments, having CIA operations, cheating on diplomatic commitments, Russia can be right also to ask for stabilizing measures. The problem is that Biden is part of the neocon process. And if you listen to Victoria Nuland's tapes, her conversation with Piat in 2014, Biden and Sullivan are part of it. Back in 2014, they're part of the regime change operation. And they have been true to course from then until today. They believe in NATO expansion. They believe in U.S. unipolarity. They believe in America's prerogatives to do what it wants with its nuclear weapon systems. They believe in the right of the United States to place its Aegis missiles wherever it wants, no matter how it's perceived as a threat to Russia. So, in December 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. You can find it online once again. And it had many stipulations, some of which were absolutely right, in my opinion, such as no further NATO enlargement, and some of which were wrong, in my opinion. But it seemed to me that just demands for rolling back commitments that had been made, which I didn't think was viable, but I thought it was a negotiating tactic.
So the Russians, for example, suggested that the NATO infrastructure should go back to the year 97 when they actually decided to take us in.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. But I do agree with negotiations. I believe you discuss, because I think that the core of Russia's interests were two things. One was no further NATO enlargement, and second was no further placement of American missile systems in Russia's neighborhood, other than through agreed treaty arrangements with Russia. Both of those, I think, are completely valid from Russia's point of view. In fact, valid from America's point of view, because I just think that they are stabilizing. And so there's a very funny idea in the Western leadership right now, which is that Russia puts forward a proposal, and then there are parts of the proposal that the United States doesn't like. And then the proposal is attacked and damned because of those parts, but no counterproposal is made. Only we cannot negotiate with that evil demon. This is a kind of game. If you are the unipolar power, you don't need to negotiate after all. And that's the U.S. position.
They would tell you they can't negotiate because Ukraine had the right to apply for NATO membership, as like every country has the right to apply for membership of whatever organization.
Yes, and the United States has the right to say no, because this is a U.S.-led military organization.
Yeah. Actually,
this is a ridiculous argument. This is completely fatuous argument. And if I, as an American voter, I absolutely object to NATO being in Ukraine. I think it's dangerous for Ukraine. I think it's dangerous for the United States. I think it's dangerous for Russia. I think it's dangerous for the world. Ukraine can apply.
From the Czech point of view, which is...
Yeah, but before we get to the Czech point of view, let me just finish from the Russian point of view. So the United States refused to negotiate. This is important to understand. You may give reasons, but from the Russian point of view, they put forward proposals repeatedly that the West refused to negotiate. And then we use the line, oh, we can't negotiate with them. You know, we need to look at ourselves too. It's very hard because we're good and they're evil. So we think. But we need to look at ourselves too. I personally call it the Jesus Christ foreign policy, because Jesus said, why do you point to the mote in the eye of the other person when you have the beam in your own eye? And what he meant was, don't only point the finger at others, try to understand your own position too. And this, I think, is wise advice. So we refused to negotiate. I called the White House to urge them to negotiate because I thought this was good for Ukraine. It would avoid a war. I thought it was good for the United States. I thought it was good for Russia. That's not contradictory. We're not in a zero-sum world. We're in a world trying to avoid war and destruction. But they refused to negotiate. Then You are talking about December 21? That's correct. Then in January 2022, the United States, through Secretary Blinken, told Russia through Foreign Minister Lavrov that the United States reserved the right to put missile systems in Ukraine.
Did they?
Yes. Please read the recent analysis of Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, very senior, who has described this meeting recently.
I didn't know.
That was January 2022. Russia launched its escalation, so-called special military operation, on February 24th, 2022. And within a few days, Zelensky said, well, we can be neutral. We could be neutral. And on that basis, papers were exchanged between Ukraine and Russia to settle the war. And the government of Turkey in Ankara, in the foreign ministry, acted as mediators. And I flew to Ankara to get a detailed briefing by the lead mediators. And so I learned all of the details of what happened. What happened was that the two sides were making dramatic progress. They were on the verge of signing an agreement. And then one day, Ukraine walked away and said, we don't negotiate anymore. That's all. Now, we do know that the US told them to walk away. We know that the UK told them to walk away. We know that Boris Johnson said we must defeat Russia to protect Western hegemony. We know that Boris Johnson told Ukraine, we will never accept neutrality, only NATO membership. You're on the Western side, and the West must win this war to protect Western hegemony. Boris Johnson has said this explicitly.
Did he explicitly say that the UK won't accept Ukraine's neutrality?
Yes, he told them.
I actually only know quotes from his visit to Kiev back then, when he said, we will not guarantee...
Yes, we will not guarantee. That's correct.
Russia.
That's correct. We will not guarantee you.
Which is slightly different from saying that...
Yes, it is slightly different. The purpose was fight on, as he has explained. We have your back. Don't negotiate. Don't make peace. Well, this is how it works. We don't want peace. We want to defeat Russia. That is explicit. Everybody says it on the Western side. I don't even know what it means, other than we all die in the end in nuclear war. I don't know what they mean. They tell me, oh, don't worry about it. Russia will give in. Thank you very much. That's nice. Is that, you're sure of that? That's 100%? Oh, how do you know? You're God? You know? Or is it 99%? So, yeah, the world ends in nuclear annihilation because 1% chance. And that's because Ukraine must be part of NATO. That you know. This is how we act, like children, like it's a board game. You know, we had the chance for negotiations repeatedly. Russia didn't make territorial demands on Ukraine before 2014, before the overthrow of Yanukovych.
So
no territorial demands.
So you obviously think that the casus belli, like the main reason for Russia to go to war, was the prospect of NATO membership of Ukraine.
Well, the prospect of NATO membership, the prospect of U.S. weapon systems, and the prospect of U.S. actions to weaken or dismember Russia. All of that.
So
this is the context of this war is U.S.-Russia relations. That's the context of this war. It is not between Ukraine and Russia. It is between the United States and Russia.
Widely used argument here in the Czech Republic is that who are we to tell the Ukrainians we won't allow you to join the NATO because we were in the same position of the beggars who wanted to get in. So we can't tell them now, fuck off.
I'm not telling Ukraine to fuck off. I'm telling them to save themselves. I'm telling them to save themselves. I was telling them for years, choose neutrality to stay safe. Join the European Union, absolutely. But choose military neutrality. Don't let the United States use you as a forward base against Russia. Don't become the threat to Russia's core security because the U.S. is pushing you into the front line. I'm not telling Ukraine to fuck off. I'm telling Ukraine to stay safe. And they're not safe. They've lost around 500,000 deaths so far. They are losing on the battlefield. We're escalating towards nuclear war. I'm telling them to stay safe. I would say, by the way, the same advice to Mexico. Please, my friends in Mexico, don't invite Russia or China to have military bases and missile systems on the Rio Grande River border with the United States. Please don't do that. That's not good for Mexico. That's what I would tell them.
What would happen if they didn't listen to your advice?
Well, when Cuba did this in 1962, we almost had nuclear war. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States did not say, oh, we agree with the people of the Czech Republic that Cuba has the right to choose its own military partners. The United States did not say that. The United States did not say, well, we know that Russia has an open door policy for the Warsaw Pact and Cuba wants to be part of it. That's their business. It's not our business. No, the United States said, we will go to war, including nuclear war, unless Russia retreats. That's what, actually, to be clear, unless the Soviet Union retreats. Yeah. This is an important distinction, by the way. But my point is, no, have some sense and some prudence. And this is not against Ukraine at all. I have been giving the best advice to Ukraine how to survive and how to stay safe. If you are next door to Russia, you do not invite the United States to come in and put its military and its missile systems in your country. You don't. And if you're really a friend of Ukraine in the Czech Republic, you don't tell them fight on. That's not advice. You say, let's make peace so that Ukrainians can live in peace. And you don't round up Ukrainian refugees and force them to the front lines to their death, which I hope Europe won't do, but which the Ukrainians are now asking for.
So the Czech government explicitly said that they won't do that.
Good, thank you. Yeah. But other countries seem ready to do it, and I hope that Europe has enough common sense and ethics and morality not to do it. But the Ukrainians are asking for it.
There is one more point I want to make, is that I guess, or I imagine that very many of our listeners will be a little bit disturbed by what you have been saying until now. So they will not agree with you because they will think that we Czechs, with our unique experience of Munich 38 and then the Soviet invasion 68, are actually in a better position than the rest of the world to understand what the Russians are trying to do. Would you think that this reference to Munich and 68 invasion is being overused in the recent history or in the geopolitical conflicts?
Look, people should understand first that in 1938, Stalin reached out to Churchill and to the French leadership, said, let's make an alliance together against Hitler. And
Churchill actually wasn't in power yet back then.
I'm sorry, to Chamberlain, excuse me.
Yeah.
I apologize. Reached out to Britain and to France, I should say. Let's make an alliance against Hitler. And the Western countries refused. This is the real tragedy. And this is the first point. The idea, second, Chamberlain obviously was extremely naive. No one is asking for naivete. I am asking for serious, non-naive negotiations. The idea that because Chamberlain was naive in 1938, that you never negotiate, it would be a mistake. What I am asking for is to understand the situation, and my own proposal is Ukraine's neutrality. That's my proposal. And I believe that it is in Ukraine's interest. I believe that it is in America's interest. I believe it is in the Czech Republic and Europe's interest. I believe that it is in Russia's interest. I see no valid grounds for the United States putting its advanced systems, its military, its alliance right up against Russia's borders. And I see no prospect that Russia is going to accept that peacefully. And I see no prospect that we are going to defeat Russia to get that done without devastation. So for these reasons, I am looking personally for a pragmatic approach. And the pragmatic approach is one that would protect Ukraine and that would make peace. And that needs to come not on the battlefield, because on the battlefield, Ukraine is very likely to lose a conventional war because it's running out of people who are dying and wounded, and because Russia will escalate to a nuclear war if it is losing a conventional war. Or it might. Maybe it's 50-50. Maybe it's 25-75. I'm not ready to gamble the world on the question of NATO enlargement to Ukraine. And while Ukraine can ask, I can say, as an American citizen, I hope my government rejects such a unwise request and explains reality to Ukraine.
Do you think do you think this August 68 comparison does it work, or do we look at the
I don't know what the comparison is. It has nothing to do with the other. I don't see any relevance or comparison to 1968.
The comparison being made here very often is that the Russians are always on the march to the west.
Well, like I said, if you want to call the Germans Nazis, and if you want to call the British endless imperialists, you can use whatever label you want. You can make simple-minded generalizations across decades of history any way you want, but it's meaningless. Countries have their history, and we have our present, and we are not condemned by our past. And Russia in 1992 was not out for war with the West or with Europe. I was there. I don't care what anyone tells me. I spoke with Boris Yeltsin. I watched the situation. I knew Mikhail Gorbachev. They were not out for conquest or war. They were for peace. And we're fools if we just say, well, that place is evil and we're good, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
I know my own country, and I've tried to explain my own country to you. And my own country has its very dark history and dark sides too. It doesn't mean that the United States is doomed to be evil. It means that we all should watch ourselves and behave properly and address the crisis that we have and find a solution to this crisis.
My last question. In case Donald Trump wins the election, do you think will the danger of the big war with Russia disappear?
I think the United States will be unstable no matter what happens in the coming years. Our political system is not working. We have two candidates who are completely inadequate for the presidency. Biden makes Brezhnev look young. Biden cannot function as president anymore. Trump is unstable. The United States is broken politically because it's a corrupted system. We're deeply divided. There's no agreement on anything. It's big money changing hands, $15 billion in this election cycle. So Europeans should understand, although I know they love America, and I can imagine in the listeners also not being able to make sense of what I'm saying or saying, what a strange idea. The United States is not in a stable place right now. Europe should take care of itself. It should be prudent. It should not want more war. It should not expect the United States to save them. It should try to find calm on the continent. And it can do so. It can do so by recognizing the security concerns on all sides, enough missile placements, enough advances of military bases everywhere, enough increased military budgets, enough of this. We need peace and calm. And the United States is not going to be a stable hand no matter what happens in November. It will not be. So Europe has to get its act together, not be so divided, but stop the hate-mongering and the war-mongering against Russia, because Russia's not going away. We need to find a way to have a modus vivendi that is peaceful, and historical analogies are to be used with great care, because it's easy to generalize. Don't generalize. Don't overgeneralize. Try to understand the circumstances and find solutions for our generation.
Mr. Sachs, thank you very much. It was quite an interesting interview in my view.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you. I appreciate it.
Thanks.